I serve as a liaison officer for COVID-19 response, and I've been heavily involved in our work with schools since spring, providing guidance, throughout the summer. And now we've got a full-fledged schools team that I'm a part of and work closely with on guiding schools on safer reopenings.
Okay, awesome. So what you're saying is you've been busy, to say the least.
A little bit, yeah. Business is booming.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so just kind of jumping right in here, one of the things that we're hoping to talk about is, as you are aware, we're in the purple tier right now. It is the most restrictive tier that I'm aware of in our county for Sacramento County, and we're joining the majority of other counties across our state that are also now in the purple tier, unfortunately. So one of the questions that we have continuously been getting is, how are some of our schools across our area able to stay open, even though we're now in a more restrictive tier where, you can't even dine out at a restaurant and yet our kids can go into school. So I'm just hoping you might be able to help walk us through that.
Sure. So I think some people may easily forget, but when the state instituted their safer blueprint, or their blueprint for a safer economy, Sacramento County actually started in the purple tier, and we were there for the first month or so in that tier. And even during that time, elementary schools were able to reopen by applying for a waiver with our office. And so we had several dozen schools open at that time while we were in the purple tier. When we moved to the red tier, that allowed schools, regardless of grade level, to open whether or not they had a waiver. And so I know that we did have several schools locally take advantage of that and begin in-person instruction. When we then reverted back to the purple tier, that then meant that schools could not reopen if they had not already done so, unless they go through that waiver process, and that's for elementary schools. But the state has spelled out pretty clearly in their guidance that schools that had reopened previously, whether it's under a waiver or whether it's when we were in the red tier and they were allowed to reopen, can remain open even when we move back into that purple tier.
Can you walk me through, is it a possibility that some of our these schools that are currently open could be pushed back into distance learning as cases continue to surge in our area, kind of like they are right now?
Sure. So we've not received any indication from the state that there are plans for any kind of broad school closures. However, I think it's important to remember that schools do need to be keeping track of whether or not they have any cases within their school community. And so if a school does have cases that rise to the level of an outbreak, that could trigger individual school closures. But at this time, we are not aware of any plans for any broad community-wide school closures for the schools that are already allowed to remain open.
Okay, so at this point right now, it would only take like a broader outbreak to close just one school specifically?
So yeah, there's a couple of things we look at for individual school closures. For a lot of schools, they have individual cohorts, so grade levels, classrooms, if you think of things like that. And that's, primarily, initially what we would look at is if we had, COVID affecting one particular cohort, a grade level, a classroom, something like that, then the first step might be a closure of that particular cohort. But if we have multiple cohorts that are impacted, or if we reach a threshold of about 5% of the overall school population, then that would likely result in a couple of weeks of closure for that particular school.
And one of the other top questions that we continuously get from parents in these districts that have moved forward with their reopening plans, is it safe for students to continue to be doing in-person learning while we know that cases are surging right now, hospitalizations are going up, and deaths are also increasing? Is it safe for these students to be doing in-person indoor learning in large gatherings?
Sure. And we get that question a lot, and I think oftentimes what folks are looking for us to say is, that there's some absolute level of zero risk. And And I think we all know that it's pretty hard to get to a zero risk level. However, California Department of Public Health and Sacramento County Public Health have both put out guidance for safer reopening, and that includes a lot of measures that schools really need to look seriously at and implement to make their school environment safer. So those range from sanitation, hand hygiene, cohorting students as much as possible, keeping them in stable groups, obviously physical distancing, face coverings. All of those serve as layers and each of them, when they're implemented with fidelity, can really do a good job of reducing that risk of transmission in the school environment.
Any other key bits of information that you want to let this audience of parents know, and I guess even teachers fall into this group of people that we've been getting questions from, especially, we hear from teachers unions that are they always want to talk about this.
Sure.
So any other key bits of information or key messages that you have for these folks in terms of our kids being back in school during these crazy times?
Yeah, absolutely. So, before a school reopens for in-person instruction, a school should be putting a lot of thought and work into figuring out how they're going to do that safely. And really that should start with putting together a really thoughtful reopening plan that really covers all of those measures that I talked about previously. And that plan should be accessible to both staff and to parents. And so I think anybody, who's trying to make an informed decision about how they feel about going back for in-person instruction should take a good look at that plan for their school. It should be on the website. The administration should be making that available. Go through that and really take a look and make sure you're comfortable with all those measures that are being planned. And then, of course, there's the next level. That's all on paper. But then it does require that the school implement that and turn that into practice. And so that's the other piece of it. And, if whether it be staff or parents have concerns about that not happening or not happening with fidelity, then absolutely they should raise those concerns with administration and try to get those addressed. I think the other important thing is, this is a very personal decision about whether or not somebody, thinks they're ready to go back. And so I think there are obviously a lot of factors that go into this. If somebody either has underlying conditions or lives in a household with somebody who has underlying conditions, then that might be an indication that, in-person instruction may be not the best choice at this time. And I realize that that's different for someone in the workplace versus, choosing to send their student back to school. But those are important considerations that people need to think about.
And then if public health officials are warning people, hey, try not to gather with extended family and multiple households for Thanksgiving celebrations next week, obviously that's on the top of mind for so many families. If public health officials are telling people not to gather for things like Thanksgiving, how does that make school any different? Because it's still an indoor gathering with people from a lot more than just one different household. So is there anything you can say to that argument?
Sure. So, I think in most cases, the school can be a very controlled environment. And I think, that really goes back to having some very thoughtful plans about how schools can take a look at all of those layers, the distancing, face coverings, cohorting, hygiene, sanitation, and those elements that they can control, and really putting in practices that ensure that those are taking place. And I think there's been a lot of discussion about, prioritization of what can be open and what can't be open. And I think there is definitely a changing narrative about, while there is concern about bringing schools back for in-person instruction, that maybe schools should be a higher priority than, some of the other things that are being considered for reopening.